Hello and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez welcoming you back to our podcast series on leadership. And I'm extremely happy today to have a very interesting guest for what it has been an interesting series of podcasts around this thing called leadership. So my next guest has a very extensive background in different industry sectors. And so initially I'd like to welcome Renata Brooks to the podcast. How are you, Renata?
Good, thank you, Eric. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thanks very much. So I'm just going to take the listenership through your CV in very quick order here, and just to give people a bit of a perspective about your experiences in this leadership space. So I have you down here as a board member of Suncare Community Service Limited,
Yep.
a board member of the New South Wales Biodiversity Conservation Trust, a member of the Joint Regional Planning Panel for South Region in New South Wales, a former director of the Stratagem Design Solutions, a commissioner to the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, a deputy chair and chair of the Finance Audit and Risk Committee for the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, and hello to all our friends at the FRDC, the Deputy Director General of Catchments and Lands/Land and Natural Resources in the New South Wales Department of Trade and Investment and Primary Industries, a member of the Audit and Risk Committee for the New South Wales Department of Trade and Investment, a member of the Board of Trustees for the McGarvey Smith Institute, and a non-executive director for the Dairy Industry Development Company. Wow, that's a lot of different roles, Renata, and
I was going to say, I have to say only the first couple of those are current, or first three, I think. So
that's fine. It just gives us some sense of what leadership experience you bring to the table. So I'm very keen to start with the following question. So what was your first leadership role? Was it industry or outside of industry, and what motivated you to take that position on?
Look, if I think back, probably the first real leadership role was I was in a state government department. I was working part-time following the birth of our first daughter, and my boss had just or was leaving to take on another job, and one of my colleagues who was also expecting her first child said to me, we should put our hat in the ring jointly for this job, which was something I certainly hadn't thought about, and it was pretty novel back in those days, about 30 years ago. So we did that, and fortunately we had, as a head of a department, someone who was prepared to give that arrangement a go, and a very supportive team as well. And yeah, that was probably the first opportunity, and I was a bit of a reluctant starter because I was, worried about juggling motherhood and the responsibilities of a leadership role. But when I look back on it, it was a really good grounding in leadership, because we were really conscious of working symbiotically together to make sure that the team wasn't getting mixed messages, that we were presenting ourselves coherently to internal, external stakeholders. So it was all about communication. It was all about working with the team. And when I think about it also with hindsight, a formal leadership role where you're doing it with someone else, so you've got that peer support as well. We were able to support each other in that learning journey. That was really valuable as well.
Wow, that's a interesting and different way to get yourself into that world of leadership. And you're not the first to say that getting into a leader role was not quite the normal way to get in, if there is a normal way to become a leader, unless you're applying directly to a position. So can I ask you, Renata, in your travels, what, if any, differences do you see between the managerial role and the leadership role in an organisation?
Look, I think they are different, but both are important. I mean, obviously leadership depends entirely on the context, and you're talking specifically about organisations, but you know, there are leaders in every walk of life, some for good, some for bad. So you can have leadership without management, and to a certain extent you can have management without leadership. But I think because to me management is about the processes and the nuts and bolts of marshalling resources, you know, financial resources, people, other physical resources to get a job done. Essentially, that's how I see management. Leadership to me is the less tangible things, the inspiration and the painting of a picture of where the journey needs to end, and those sorts of characteristics. So yeah, I guess to me they're differences, and depending on the situation, you need more or less of those skills in those areas to be able to be effective. And I guess reflecting on my current more recent experiences, board leadership is a different thing again, because you're working as one of a team. And I guess in executive leadership as well, you're quite often working as one of a team. So it's you've got those influencing and team leadership skills as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, when reading out that very extensive and quite diverse set of positions you've held, it looks like you've had those leadership experiences in government and board type settings. So you've had to apply different skill sets in different areas. So that's a nice segue, I guess, in terms of asking the next question. And in all walks of life, leaders will make some mistakes. How do you mistake, or mistakes, whatever the term may be? For me, it's multiple mistakes that I've had to learn by in my travels. But in your experience, how do you engage with a mistake that's attributed to you as a leader, Renata?
Look, I might start by, you know, challenging you a little bit on what a mistake is.
Sure. Okay. Challenge away.
You know, because I think a mistake to me is, you know, making a mistake in adding up numbers, or a spelling mistake. It's a black and white concept, and in leadership, in my experience, it's rarely black and white. And so I think it's you know, to me, it's more important to acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, to actually work with the people that are part of your leadership world, to you know, look at making the best decision in the circumstances, and then taking the opportunity to reflect on and learn from those experiences. So I think it's really important to be confident in your decision makings, and not necessarily look back and think, oh gee, I made a whole lot of mistakes there. It's what have I learned from those experiences, what worked well, what didn't work so well. And in most situations, it's not, you know, it's not like a disaster. It's maybe, if you look at it from this perspective, it went well, but if you look at it from another perspective, it didn't go so well, or is perceived as not going so well. So I think that taking time out to actually reflect, and I learned an enormous amount. I had over my time a fair bit of involvement with emergency responses to biosecurity incidents. I learned a lot from the kind of very structured approach that goes with emergency management. And one of those pieces of that structure is to do an after action review, so that you actually have a formal process of sitting down with people and in the team and saying, you know, what worked, what have we learned, and actually capturing that stuff.
Oh wow! And that's a typical part of that process in biosecurity incidents.
Yeah, and that does give you that opportunity to actually acknowledge where things didn't go so well, and sometimes that is something that you acknowledge yourself as a leader, but it also may be just some aspect that you can do something about in the future and learn from your mistakes. So I think that continuous improvement thing is really important, and not thinking that there's ever such a thing as a perfect decision. Because the other thing for me is making decisions as a leader, you sometimes need to take a slow and considered approach where you access information, commission more information, really work on who's potentially impacted and engage with those people and take your time over a decision. And that can be the right approach in some circumstances. In other circumstances, you've just got to make a decision, and you've got to make a decision quickly. And again, I draw on emergency management for that kind of insight. Because you don't always have all the information, but you can't just sit back and do nothing. So you've got to make a decision. And I think the real art in leadership is knowing, and it's probably something that only comes with experience, knowing which is the right approach to take in which circumstance. Because if you take too long, you can miss an opportunity, or indecision can become its own problem.
So, for the benefit of those listening, Renata's caught me out. I am a naive, young career leader, and look, I often, in my own the world of work that I work in, which is the commercial fishery space, that I often think sometimes, could I've made a better decision, and I sometimes find myself second guessing what I've done, and it's nice to hear that maybe part of what I could do better in the future is just to reflect on what I've done and try and move on and learn from that stuff. But I think it is experience-wise too, because I guess, given the nature of some of the things that I deal with in my industry, can be sometimes very reactive, and sometimes having that headspace to make a better decision, you just don't get it. You just have to be willing to make a call and try and live with the consequences of that call. So no, that was quite an interesting response. Can I ask you, Renata, what have you found to be the most difficult part of being a leader in your travels?
Look, I think it's probably you take on responsibility as a leader, and that's not something that you can step away from once you've said yes to the gig. And I think that applies in an organisational sense, as well as in all kinds of other situations where you might step into a leadership role of some kind. You can't have a bad day and crawl under the table. You've got to be there, and you've got to keep being a leader. Not that I ever really thought of myself that way particularly. It's just you get on and do the job, but you do have to be committed, and you do have to take that responsibility. The buck stops with you, and it stops with you 24/7, notwithstanding, you manage your work-life balance and all that kind of thing, but you've got to have that responsibility.
Yeah, agree. So moving away from the sort of more negative aspects of what's the most difficult thing about being a leader, how do you, as a leader, measure success? And I don't necessarily mean that to be about a KPI or a deliverable. In its broadest terms, how do you measure success as a leader?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very good question, because
thank you.
KPIs, they're part of it, but when I think about, if I talk to people and in terms of how did you find person X as a leader, the sorts of things people give as answers are things like, they were really inspiring, or we were really clear on the goal we were trying to aim for, or I was so supported in terms of my personal growth, or they taught me that you can really push for something that you never thought would be possible, and you can get it. So to me, it's all those qualities that people rate a leader against. It's those intangible things. And I was thinking about, not that I actually watched it, but we had Bob Hawke's passing recently and his funeral, and I don't think anyone at the funeral was talking about KPIs. You know, that's not how his leadership was measured. It was all those intangible things.
No, and his passing and his leadership was always looked through that prism of politics, and that's one of the interesting things about talking about this subject is, and I take your point from the very start of the podcast, that leadership can occur in lots of different settings, not just a formal business or organizational setting. So, yeah, and to me, in my experience, success is watching other people grow in organizations or in the endeavor in which, in the field that you're in, that you're leading, to see other people flourish and do better and get better at something is always a good thing. And to me, it's about the people element of being a leader. But that metric, if you can call it that, will be different for each person. So can I just in moving on with unpacking this leadership thing a little bit more, I've got 3 statements that I'd like to put to you to get your perspective on. And as always with these things, there's no right or wrong answer. But what are your thoughts on the following? On the job experience develops better leaders.
Look, I think experience is incredibly important, and as we discussed earlier, learning from that experience and that whole process of continuous improvement is really important. So, is it enough? I guess is the question, and I think there can be limitations to a leadership environment, which can mean you just are only exposed to a certain spectrum of ideas, for want of a better description, or you can inadvertently learn bad habits, if I can put that in inverted commas, and sometimes you need to broaden your experiences, but that's still a process of broadening experience, which I guess is still a form of on-the-job experience. So do I think that develops better leaders? I certainly think experience is a really critical aspect of leadership.
So as a follow-on then, formal education helps to develop better leaders, sorry.
Yeah, and I think formal education, I would say is not mandatory, and I think historically there have been many leaders who did not have formal qualifications, but I think it is valuable in terms of giving you some of the tools, giving you the opportunity to benchmark the way you do things against your peers, particularly I think if you are undertaking the formal education alongside the experience. I think that's a good combination, because you've got that opportunity then to use it as part of that continuous improvement learning journey that we've been talking about. And I think it also sometimes gives you the jargon, for want of a better word, that allows you to perhaps talk more confidently in terms of being a leader. So I think that can be a kind of an additional benefit.
As part of the toolkit. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's great.
Toolkit, yeah.
That's great. So last statement here, and this one's always throwing up a few interesting comments, so I'm looking forward to your response on this one. Leaders are born, not made.
Well, that gets into that whole nature versus nurture.
So do you have a view?
Look, I guess my view is just about anyone can be a leader. I think I think there are a lot of people who could be leaders that either don't see themselves as having leadership potential, or others don't see them as having leadership potential because of our societal norms and the way we've done things. And I think we're missing out on a huge amount of leadership talent as a result of that. I still think women are underrepresented in leadership roles. I think there are opportunities for people from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds that aren't necessarily, those people aren't necessarily being tapped into in terms of their leadership potential. So, I guess I suppose I'm very much on the made not born side of the equation.
Okay, now that's fine, and I'm happy you had a laugh at this, because everyone sort of said, "Oh wow, well, so where do I sit?" And every response has been uniquely different for the person. So, in my perspective, I think I'm more leaning towards your view of it, is that we could build someone to be a leader. Now, the degree to how effective that leader is into the future, that's always that X variable, because different situations will bring out, in my experience, different things in a leader. So, and the big example of that I can think of, at least from a Queensland perspective, was when we had those natural disasters in the north, and a former premier of the state, Anna Bligh, took over the reins and led quite well from the front, and was seen to be doing the things that a leader would need to do in a crisis situation. And it sort of picked up everyone's ears, sort of, oh wow, so she's given us a way forward, and this is what this is how the state is going to respond. And it was very much in response to the situation. So yeah, I tend to agree with you that people can be taken to a point and become leaders, but again, how effective they are in the future is always up for discussion. So can I take you to the next question? This is around some of the studies that I'm doing, and I'm definitely not asking you to give me yes, I support you, or don't support me in the research that I'm doing, but I have a question that I've been asking people around: what are the core leader capabilities that leaders will need into the future? And part of my argument is that two of the critical ones that are out in that mix are strategic thinking and foresight. What in your travels, what do you think about those two in that package of leader capabilities?
Look, I think again, it's entirely situational. If you're talking about leadership of an organisation or an industry, I think those qualities are really important. You have to be able to look ahead. You have to be able to be thinking strategically to take an organisation forward, etc. But I guess the two things I think about as a kind of a break on that. One is it depends a lot on the people who are following you. And I don't like to think of leaders and followers. I think of it more as a team that's working together, really. And there are often people, with leadership roles within that team as well. So I think it's really important to understand where those people are at any one time. And sometimes, strategic thinking and foresight is the last thing you need to energise and motivate and inspire a particular community group of people, because they're under extraordinary pressure for any number of reasons. So I think that the context is really important. there. And I think you also used a really interesting example there of Anna Bligh during that natural disaster. And in situations like that, I think strategic thinking and foresight aren't necessarily the absolutely critical leadership capabilities either. So it's not that you necessarily dispense with those, and I think they're important because you need to be able to see forward as well then, but they're maybe not the things that come to the fore. So it seems to me that it is situational, and it does depend very much on the circumstances.
Wow, that's excellent, and that's different again in terms of responses, and again, until you have discussions like these with people that the context and the situation to me has not been in my mind as front of my mind as I think that it should be, and that's really reflective of life in different leadership roles. Is that your situation, if you're in whatever industry or whatever walk of life that you're a leader, will change from now and then, and that will draw on different skills in your toolkit, and hopefully you've got those resources to be able to respond. So no, that was great. So final question for you, Renata, and this is one of those crystal ball things, but I'm again very, very much interested to hear your perspective on this. What would you say to a younger version of yourself to be a more effective leader, if you had the chance just to have a chat to yourself, a younger version of yourself?
Look, I think, we've talked a lot about continuous learning, and I think you learn a lot from watching how other people lead. But I think one of the pieces of advice I'd give my younger self is, in the end, everyone has a unique set of capabilities, and you need to be true to yourself ultimately, and sometimes the way other people do things aren't necessarily the right things for you. So I think it's really important for people to be selective about the opportunities to do things differently, to improve in terms of their personal capabilities, I guess. So I think that's something I've learned. And probably the other thing I'd say is I think mentoring and peer support is really important, and it's something I probably could have used more at various periods of my career. So it's certainly something I'd be recommending to young leaders coming through, is to take advantage of those sorts of opportunities.
Renata, thank you for your time. That was a brilliant way to end the podcast. For those that have joined me and may have missed the start, please go back and listen to this podcast like the others, some very valuable insights on leadership. And again, I'd like to thank Renata Brooks for her time. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you, Eric.
And I'll catch everyone else on the next podcast. Thanks very much.
Thanks.